Hello, I'm Kathleen Olive, and today Limelight Arts Travel's Nick Gordon and I are speaking about a work that almost requires no introduction. Michelangelo's giant sculpture of David, in the moments before he stuns and slays Goliath, is one of Western art's most recognisable images, and it's one of the most visited artworks in all of Italy. Michelangelo's David has a fascinating history of technical difficulty, professional rivalry, and even an ambivalent early reception, as well as a complex view of human nature and the possibilities of artistic achievement. We think it's well worth a closer look.
Welcome, Kathleen.
Hi, Nick.
So what are we going to talk about today?
Well, we've chosen something that we can chat about together, and that is a very well-known work of art. It is Michelangelo's statue of David, which is carved out of marble. It's in the Accademia Art Gallery in Florence today. I'm sure it's well known to lots of listeners.
Absolutely, as one of the most famous works of Italian Renaissance art. It's one of the most reproduced works of Italian Renaissance art, whether that's reproduced in photography, whether that's reproduced in life-sized, exact laser-cut models, or whether it's in lots of little figurines that go inside snow globes and are sold out front of the Accademia today. So we have here David, who is being shown as given by his proportions, as a youngish man. Kind of mid to late teens at the youngest. He has, you can see across his torso, the musculature is very well formed. There is not an ounce of fat over his abdomen. His shoulders are about 1.5 times the width of his hips, so he's quite broad-shouldered. He's standing there. His weight is resting on one foot, and that foot is also joined to the tree stump that helps weight this sculpture so it doesn't fall over. So he has wonderful contrapposto. His left foot is perched on the edge of the marble and is not bearing the weight of his body. So his weight is going straight down his right leg. His right arm hangs down beside his body. His hands are a little bit larger than we might think, but we'll come to talking about that in a little bit perhaps. And as he stands there with his weight leaning back onto his right leg, he's holding a sling over his left shoulder with his left arm, and he's looking out over that gap between his shoulder and his hand on his left-hand side, and looking out to be able to concentrate on a figure in the distance.
I mean, it's just a single male nude figure here, a heroic male nude, standing there strong and ready and proud in a classical tradition. But David's actually a Jewish hero. So, in fact, the scene that this one person evokes, he evokes an entire story, really, in one figure. And that's, of course, the story of David's triumph over Goliath, a huge warrior who was challenging the Jewish people. And David, despite being, according to the story, just a prepubescent child, is able to go out faithfully and courageously against Goliath and fell him with a stone from a slingshot before cutting his head off and finishing the giant of Goliath off entirely. So although we've only got one male nude figure here, he evokes really a whole story about courage and triumph against the odds, really.
And when we think of this as a story and how kind of a single figure standing there is able to evoke so much, I think it draws our attention to what part of the story is this sculpture picking up on. So we're used to earlier versions of David and Goliath, or David, such as Donatello's beautiful one in the Bargello in Florence, which takes place after the fact, where you've kind of got a prepubescent David standing on Goliath's head, looking rather pleased with himself, and you can almost see the sword dripping with the blood underneath it. Whereas we don't have that scene taking place here. Michelangelo is showing us a different aspect of this story.
Michelangelo's more or less the same age as we see this figure of David when he carves this sculpture, isn't he? So he's 25 years old when he makes this work of art. We haven't said how big it is, but it's much bigger than life size. It's 5 meters, stands at 5 meters tall. So it's a very large over life-sized sculpture in marble. What was the purpose of this artwork?
Well, David is one of the figures who represents Florence, and this is from well before Michelangelo's time. So Florence had seen itself as being kind of the up-and-comer, but it's the smaller power in Italy, and it's often having to challenge or stand up for itself against much larger, more militarily powerful cities, such as Milan, for example. In this context, too, we kind of have the difficulties with the fall of the Medici in Florence, the arrival of the French, so suddenly you've got Florence having to negotiate a relationship with the kings of France, the popes are on their back about other things, order has fallen apart in Italy, and yet David still symbolised for Florence the Republic, kind of this little figure who's going to stand up and be victorious over much, much greater powers.
So as you've alluded to there, at the end of the 15th century, Florence is in political turmoil within itself as a city. There is a struggle with one dynasty trying to take effective rule of the entire government. That's the Medici family that Michelangelo grew up in the very bosom of, where he tells us himself that he ate at the same table every evening as one of the most powerful members of that family, the Lorenzo the Magnificent. But at the end of the 15th century, as you've described, there's a bit of an interregnum where the Medici fall and the French instead arrive in the city of Florence before they're also expelled in turn, and a kind of a last gasp of republicanism takes over Florence. So this sculpture, this artwork, is actually commissioned from Michelangelo by the government of the city of Florence. Is that right?
Absolutely. And they're needing, I think, this symbol of their triumph. They've got already numerous symbols that have been built up for the city representing people like either David or Judith from Judith and Holofernes. These series of civic symbols in the city that represent the little fella who's going to kind of be triumphant over the large one, and now they need the biggest one of all, as kind of the city really feels like it's in the middle of a life and death crisis for the Republic.
But the size of David here is also connected not just to the metaphorical size of a victor that the city of Florence, particularly its Republican government, needs at this point in time. It's also connected to where this sculpture was going to be placed. So the city of Florence commissions this work from Michelangelo as a form of ornament for the huge Florence cathedral that stands in the centre of town and was coming more and more to a point of completion at this point of time in the early 16th century. So David, as a figure of strength, symbolizing the city of Florence, he's also, of course, a part of the Jewish tradition and also one of the most important prophets and forebears of Christ. So he's also a central part of the Christian narrative as well. And as such, it was quite fitting to hoist this gigantic marble statue up onto one of the upper levels of the exterior of Florence Cathedral to have it standing as both a protective civic symbol but also a symbol of spiritual Christian importance as well.
Absolutely. And it's sort of when we start thinking about that original location that it was meant to be built, that does make sense of the size of it. And there are some interpretations of that too, which say, well, because it was going to be so high, that's why his hands and his head seem a little bit oversized compared to his body. It's a way of, because if you're looking at something from a long way underneath, certain features need to appear larger, otherwise they won't appear in scale. The downside of that theory is this sculpture was originally intended to be placed so high up in the cathedral that it wouldn't have mattered how big you made his head. It was just going to be too far away for anybody to really actually see it.
And in fact, if you visited Florence Cathedral, you'll know that there isn't a great big row of gigantic statues of saints making their way around the outside of the roof of Florence Cathedral. Sculptures such as this one weren't actually erected in place on the upper levels of Florence Cathedral, partly because they wouldn't have been able to be seen at all. It's just too big a building. The distances are just too great to be able to see even a huge statue such as this one, but also because it seems it would have started to damage the structure of the building itself. The building just couldn't cope with the weight of statues like this one. So a few years ago, Florence actually made a copy of this statue in fiberglass, but even the fiberglass statue had an effect on the structure of the building. The detectors that they have in Florence Cathedral to warn against things like earthquakes and aftershocks the needle really started to vibrate when the copy of this work in fiberglass was erected in one of the presumed positions for Michelangelo's work. And that's really also the kind of technical difficulties of getting the sculpture up there and not damaging the building in its intended location. It also kind of alludes to some of the technical difficulties that Michelangelo encountered when making this work, because he certainly wasn't the first person to work on this block of marble, was he?
No, and how many people had worked on this before?
I couldn't tell you exactly how many people, but certainly great sculptors such as Agostino di Duccio, who is one of the best followers of Donatello as a sculptor, had tried to work with this giant block of Carrara marble, which had been secured by the organisation that looked after the fabric of the cathedral at great cost and labour from the quarries in Tuscany, and hadn't been able to because of a flaw running through the marble that it was quite difficult to work with. It was going to shear off in unpredictable ways because of a flaw running through a vein in the marble itself. So what kind of things, when you look at this and you think about the technical skill involved in Michelangelo carving this from an abandoned, flawed block of marble that had stood in the centre of Florence with no one working on it for some time, what kind of technical challenges is he facing here?
Well, firstly, you've got to getting the space large enough to be able to work on this. You need to have a building. If this sculpture is more than 5 meters tall, if you're going to be working on it in a way that keeps it balanced, you need to be able to stand it somewhere with a roof that is well and truly higher than 5 meters. You have to be able to build a scaffold around it. You need to be able to work at different layers of it. You can't remove too much of the bottom while you've left all that weight on the top, otherwise the entire thing will crack under its own weight. You've then got to be able to take something that is, say, 2.5 times your height and keep all of those proportions, all of that level of detail perfectly in mind. And keeping, if you think of this as having a scaffold around it, you don't get a perfect view of the sculpture while you're working on it. You're usually working at it from, say, 30, 45 centimeters away. This is something that is, say, 2 stories high, imagine trying to kind of paint a section of your wall at home on the outside. If you've got 2 stories, you just can't see. So you have to be able to keep the sculpture, its proportions perfectly in mind. You have to know your process of sculpting, how you're going to work away at something. And you need to have that perfectly in mind throughout the entire creation of it. If you have a bad day and you drill down too far, all of a sudden he doesn't have a shoulder anymore, and the marble becomes even more useless than it was. So it's that mental feat of Michelangelo, as well as his skill as a sculptor, that mental feat of being able to keep something so perfectly, wonderfully proportioned on such a scale, and be able to execute it while only being 35, 45 centimeters away from it at any one point in time.
So we know how other sculptors would have approached a work such as this in marble at that time. We know they would have used calipers to mark out more or less the parts of the block that they were going to start working into, that they would have removed really big parts of marble that they weren't going to incorporate in the final design with big chisels, that they would have moved their way down to smaller and smaller chisels and hammers, and that finally for things like hair, for example, and very fine detail, that they would even have used drills. And so we know what other sculptors would have done with a block of marble like this. We know that they also probably would have used what we would call modelli, so small sculpted works in terracotta or in plaster, for example, that would have helped them, as you say, keep that final work in their mind's eye. And it's probably Michelangelo, being such a great draftsman, probably would have had sketches of the intended work that he would have used to help guide him as he went along. But we also know that Michelangelo works very differently as a sculptor in stone. He tells us quite specifically that he carves from the front to the back of a work, excavating the person, the figure, as he goes, revealing them from the depths of the stone within. And in some ways that's really connected to his personal philosophy as an artist, isn't it?
Absolutely. that kind of he had grown up at that same dinner table where he kind of was sitting with Lorenzo the Magnificent. The future Pope Leo X was at that dinner table too. But this was a household that was at the very forefront of the rediscovery of Platonic philosophy in Italy in the later 15th century. And he would have been exposed to these ideas of Neoplatonism from the people who are translating Plato, commenting on Plato. He's being brought up by people who are at the very forefront of this new philosophy, and this idea of perfection, their idea of being a perfect form of everything, but also this idea that human beings have within them the capacity to create things that are perfect. And that's a capacity that only God and people had. No other creature, not even angels, have the power of creativity. And Michelangelo seems to really take hold of this idea of this kind of this God-given gift to be able to even have a hope of being able to create something perfect. At the same time, he's also a deeply pious man and knows that there's being kind of a post-lapsarian person, there's always going to be a limitation of some sort on his capacity. He can never actually be godlike in his power of perfection, but he can at least hope to get close to it.
And he certainly does seem to bring that out here in the focus on the hand and on the head. So if I think about what you've just said, I think about Michelangelo kind of alternating between what he can conceive of with his mind and what he can actually accomplish with his physical body. And he drew that comparison himself thinking about David. He said, what David was able to do with the sling and the stones, I'm able to do with my bow, the bow being one of the instruments, a kind of saw that sculptors used to hew through stone. So he's kind of explicitly comparing himself as an artist to David and what David was able to achieve, a union between David's mind that exploited the weakness of Goliath and his physical actions that executed the death of Goliath through stunning him with the stones that lie within that giant hand. Do you see anything else in those big proportions of the hand and that intent gaze that David has across his left shoulder?
I do. I think it's partly in that gaze that as you move around the sculpture, the expression on that face becomes readable. You can read different emotions into that face. So you can tell that he is concentrating, but is this apprehension? Is this a degree of determination? Is there any kind of sense, or does he have a sense of knowing his own destiny, or is he doubting his capacity? Am I really big enough to kind of kill a giant or knock him out with a stone from a great distance? So as you move around it, you see a lot of different thoughts running through. We can read a lot of different thoughts into that face, but unifying all of those thoughts is that intensity of that gaze, looking out. And I think that draws us up to looking through what is kind of a magnificently sculpted body. So always looking up towards this face, looking up to what it is that would animate this body if it weren't stone.
A kind of perfect balance between the active life and the contemplative life, something that had been much discussed in the culture of Florence in the generations just before Michelangelo, to be what was thought of as a universal man, or what we would call a Renaissance man. You had to hold those two forces in a perfect balance, your active life and your thoughtful life. And the true universal person could hold both of those in perfect balance. Just as I think we visually see David here in a perfect balance, in a moment of suspension, all of that weight, that engineering weight running down through the right-hand side of his body, and that knee kind of stepping up from the left. We've got him in the moment of perfect balance between active and contemplative as he steps forward to act into the moment. He's a great kind of symbol of action at the same time as he embodies in that subtlety of his expression all of the ambivalence of someone who's caught up in these circumstances as well. And ambivalence is an interesting way to think about the reception of this work too, because we look at this and see this as such a key work of the Italian Renaissance, but the immediate response to this sculpture was quite conflicted, wasn't it?
Yeah, and what sort of conflicted responses come to mind that you remember from this work?
Well, certainly there was the debate about where to actually place this once it was discovered that it wasn't going to work on top of the cathedral, that there was no hope of getting it up there. Once there was much discussion too about how fragile the marble itself was because of that floor, and there's still debate about that today. You know, David's ankles are still monitored by special equipment, and the ground around the statue in the Accademia has now been stabilised because Florence is in an earthquake zone. So there was much debate about where you could put this without it actually falling apart, and a large vocal majority who talked about this as a great work of art that should be displayed because it was such an exceptional work of art recognised at the moment of its completion. But there were certainly detractors as well. So Michelangelo, a young man at this stage in his career, just before he goes down to Rome to work on the tomb of Pope Julius, he's actually locked into a kind of artistic competition with the eminence grise of the Florentine art world at this time, and that's Leonardo da Vinci. The two of them are working on competing painting cycles in the very same location at this time. And Leonardo says that this work brings shame to Florence. It brings shame to Florence because the marble itself is flawed, and he says it brings shame to Florence because David is unclothed. He was quite scandalised by the nudity, and he actually suggested that this work should be tucked at the back of a loggia that's in a central place in Florence, rather than displayed for everyone to see outside the town hall, which is where in fact it ends up being displayed. So there's even some ambivalence about the reception of it in its own time.
And you can imagine then, so you can imagine where the replica is today outside the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. That's where this sculpture was until 1873. But then around it, you have a generation after generation after generation of great sculptors who would get commissioned to create a piece of work that has to sit next to a work like this that looks so, which is kind of increasingly recognised as one of the crowning achievements of that period of the Italian Renaissance. And you can imagine that kind of every sculptor looks at this and says, well, that's what Michelangelo could do at 25. How do I outdo something so perfect? So you get artists like Benvenuto Cellini, for example, to compete with this sculpture, creates a work in bronze out of a single casting on a scale that had never been done before from a single cast piece of bronze. It's an engineering feat, but it's also visually stunning. And it's hard not to think that kind of artists working in that space know that kind of this is the bar that they have to at least try and match.
So it is really a testament to this work as a masterwork that it could be designed for one location, end up in another where it has to speak to generations of preceding sculptures in the square outside Florence's town hall where there's still a replica, and also speak to generations of subsequent sculptures that are designed to go into that same space with it, but that it also looks so perfectly at home in this one grand neoclassical hall that's designed for it in the Accademia Art Institute in Florence at the end of the 19th century. So it works just as perfectly in splendid isolation as we see it today, as it does as we see it today as a replica in the town square of Florence, speaking to all the generations of great Florentine sculpture that preceded it and that would follow it too.
I think it makes it a truly exceptional work of art.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Kathleen.
You've been listening to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.